Thank you, Deborah. So we are coming close to the end of our learning together about Franz Rosenzweig. We have a session this week, and then I believe a session next week, and that is the last two of our time together. What I wanted to do, at least for the two sessions that we have remaining, are to focus on two extremely important ideas in Rosenzweig's thought. What we're going to look at today is really the question of what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself, right? V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, very important, as we know, zeh klal gadol b'Torah, as Rabbi Akiva says it, but also very difficult to even understand or implement mitzvah. And then next week, we're going to look at, in our concluding session, how Rosenzweig conceives of redemption, or at least how he wants us to start thinking about what it means to hope for, pray for, desire, anticipate redemption. He did write a book called The Star of Redemption. So if you put the thing in your title of your book, it usually means it's important. So that'll be our last session. But in terms of this question of ethics, this question of the mitzvah v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, as I said, this is central for Franz Rosenzweig. Large portions of the Star of Redemption, his writings are dedicated to this question of what does it mean to love the other. And for Franz Rosenzweig, the question of what it means to love the other is very much, as Rabbi Akiva said, zeh klal gadol b'Torah. Right? Rosenzweig sees the central thrust of the Torah as existing on two axes, and we know this, right? There is revelation, in which is God's call to us, God's call of love to us, which transforms us. And that's one axis. We might call that the vertical axis. And then there is also, in addition, the horizontal axis, our relationship towards others. And what revelation does is it creates the very possibility of enabling us to do the mitzvah of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Again, a very important mitzvah, difficult mitzvah, and in many ways, the fulfillment of redemption itself, right? To live in a redeemed world, I think we all know this, is to live in a world in which everyone loves each other. But of course, again, as we've talked about throughout these sessions, the word love gets thrown around all the time. Rarely do we understand what it means, and rarely do we understand how difficult and problematic it really is for us. So we're going to look today, as I said, on how Rosenzweig conceives of the nature of what it means to love another. But before we get into Rosenzweig, I'm going to once again set up Rosenzweig with Sigmund Freud, because particularly on the notion of interpersonal relationships, Rosenzweig and Freud have a lot in common. Rosenzweig is influenced by Freud. They're contemporaries. I mean, Rosenzweig's a bit younger, but Rosenzweig is directly influenced by Freud. He cites him in a few places. And on the issues of our relationships with others, they're very much in alignment. Or let me put it this way. They're very much in agreement about what the problems are, right? What the problems are being in relationship with others. What we'll see in a moment is that Freud diagnoses the problem very powerfully, very compellingly. He doesn't have an answer. Rosenzweig wants to argue that there is an answer. So let's begin with Freud. This is from Civilization and Its Discontents, one of Freud's final works. This is his great work of cultural criticism, him trying to understand what it means to be a human being in the world, and all the challenges and impossibilities that come along with that. And in Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud actually has a whole section where he analyzes the mitzvah v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, right? That you should love your neighbor as yourself. He gives it a very thorough and very compelling analysis. I have to be honest with you, this is probably one of the most important analyses of this idea that you will ever find. And part of what I appreciate about it is that, like, unlike many other thinkers before Freud is very cynical about the possibility of this. And for good reason, as we're going to see, right? Religious thinkers all the time want to throw out, again, Christian and Jewish, right? You should love the other, right? What's the problem? How are all the problems in our world going to be solved? Well, as the Beatles said, right? All you need is love, right? That is often what you find in religious discourse. You'll even find that sometimes even in secular discourse. The challenge is that when we look at love closely and we look at our love relationships, we find that again, loving the other, really not so simple, maybe even impossible, as Freud is going to argue here. So he begins here again. He says, "Thou shalt love the neighbor as thyself." That's the mitzvah. That's the central mitzvah of the Torah. Again, from the Jewish perspective and from the Christian perspective as well. He says, "Let us adopt a naive attitude towards it, as though we are hearing it for the first time." He's saying, you know what? Before we sort of try to understand it through a traditional religious lens,
let us try to understand it naively. Let's just look at it and try to see what this is telling us. And again, what is it trying to encourage us to do? What he says is that we shall be unable then to suppress a feeling of surprise and bewilderment. If we look at this mitzvah seriously, we have to immediately ask ourselves, we're going to be surprised or perplexed as to what exactly is this is going on here? What is this mitzvah really asking us to do? And is it even possible? He says, why should we do it? What good will it do us? But above all, how shall we achieve it? How can it be possible? So he's noting, okay, Torah says you should love your neighbor as yourself, right? Even again, within secular ethics, you find this notion of love being central to how we relate to others. But again, what's going on here? Why is love seen as the answer? And even if it is the answer, how would even want to achieve it? Is it even possible? I mean, we've talked about before, right? The people that we truly love in this world are usually a rather small number, right? Maybe it's our spouse, our children, our parents, our family, our closest friends, right? And I think most of us would argue that if we had to make a list of the people we love, it's not going to be larger than, 10 or 15 people, right? There's a limit to it. So if the biblical commandment is you must love your neighbors yourself, which makes it sound like your love must be limitless, that your love must be unlimited, that it must be universal, then we have to ask ourselves, again, is such a thing really even possible? Or is it religion's way of trying to cover up for an insolvable problem? I mean, that's, I think, to a certain extent what Freud is recognizing, that maybe this is something we just like to say. Because if we think of it as a way to solve all of our moral, ethical problems, all of our political problems, but in reality, it's not even possible. And that's exactly why we say it, because it covers up for the fact that we can't actually resolve all our contradictions and disputes and antagonism. So here's how Freud, again, sort of sets up his cynicism here about this mitzvah, Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. He says, he notes here that my love is something valuable to me, to which I ought not to throw away without reflection, right? Those things that we love are those things that are most precious to us, right? So again, if that's the case, then love isn't something we just throw around the world, right? Love is limited, right? Value is always dependent on that which is limited, right? The rarer something is, the more valuable it is, right? Therefore, the fact that I love fewer people rather than more people speaks to the value of my love, right? You probably heard this before. If you love everybody, then again, what is the value of that, right? How is your relationship with one person in any way, different from another, right? Our love is supposed to be something valuable to us. It's something we don't just give away to everyone, just like the things that are valuable to us, we don't just throw away casually, right? We hold on to them. We use them sparingly, only in circumstances and situations where we think it's most important. And because our love is valuable, right? He says, it imposes duties on me for whose fulfillment I must be ready to make sacrifices. Right? This line I love because it may be Freud at his most Jewish. He says that to love something is to have a duty towards it. Right? If you love something, it makes you responsible for it. You have a duty, you have responsibility, and the way that duty and responsibility gets manifest is through a willingness to sacrifice, right? And again, this is a very traditional religious perspective in a sense, even though Freud is avowedly secular. But we know this, again, from the basic understanding of the Torah that we've been looking at constantly, particularly with Rosenzweig's lens, right? If you love God, that means you have responsibilities, obligations to God, and you must be willing to make sacrifices for God. And if that is true for God, we also understand intuitively that that also equally applies in our love relationships as well with human beings, right? If I love my spouse, that imposes on me, that love for her, right? Duties and responsibilities towards her. And those duties and responsibilities mean if I take my love seriously, then I'm going to be willing and need to make sacrifices for her, right? So that line is extremely, extremely important the way we think about love. Love isn't just something we throw away freely, right? I think we might have even talked about this in an earlier session, right? Free love of the 60s, again, sort of implied like it was something I give over here and something I give over there. And there's a certain casual nature to it. That's why free love was often tied up with notions of casual sex. But Freud is saying that love is never casual, right? Love is never just something that I'm sort of in for a moment and then it could change to something else 5 minutes later. Love imposes duties, right? Responsibilities, which means fixes you in your relationship to the other, fixes you in place, right? If you have a duty to that which you love, it can't be that 5 minutes later that duty no longer exists, right? What makes the duty real, that makes the responsibility real, is the fact that it in some way endures. That's Freud's second point. And then his third point is, if I love someone, he must deserve it in some way, right? And this is really, really important for Freud and really, really important for us as well. We don't just love people stam. We don't just love people because we love them. At least that's not the way we typically think about it. We usually assume that we love somebody because they are deserving of it, right? There is something about them that makes them worthy of our love. And that is very, very important to us, right? We can't really imagine loving somebody who doesn't really deserve it. Because if they don't really deserve it, then to feel like we should love them doesn't feel like something good. It actually feels like something really painful and bad, right? Because again, like we want to love those things that are worthy of our love. So what Freud sets up here with these three conditions, basically, that love is valuable, that love imposes duties and responsibilities, and even sacrifice, and that we love those things that we believe deserve it. Freud understands that when we conceive of love in this way, and I think he's absolutely right, this is the way we conceive of love, it means that the scope of our love, the circle of our love is going to be rather limited, because not everybody is going to be deserving of our love. Not everybody is going to be somebody we feel we are responsible to. And again, as we said, if love is valuable, it's not something we just throw around to whoever is walking down the street, right? It's limited. It's limited to those, again, who we feel deserve it. And it's because of this that Freud thinks that this commandment of loving the neighbor as yourself is really something impossible, because how many people fit these three requirements? And as I said, we make our list of those we love. It's not a large list, but everybody on that list on some level would fit these requirements for us. Freud goes on to, again, sort of make one final point here about who are those that we love. He says, well, the people that we love are those who deserve it. And again, what does it mean to deserve it? And these are two qualifications that he makes here. And this is very important because we're going to see how Rosenzweig implicitly picks up on these as well, even though Freud writes this essay after Rosenzweig writes The Star of Redemption, but they're dealing with the same problem. Freud says, the other deserves my love if he is like me in important ways that I can love myself in him. And basically, I love the other because I see myself in the other, right? This is love as narcissism. This is something we've been talking about all along, right? This is love such that I look at the other and it is like looking in the mirror. And in truth, most of the people we love, maybe all of the people we love, are like us in very, very significant ways. Again, what often attracts us to our spouse is that there's something about them that we have in common, right? What attracts us to our children is the fact that not only are they like us, right? They come from us, right? It's very easy to see ourselves in our children because they are the product of ourselves and our spouse. So it's very easy to look at our children and potentially feel like we're looking in the mirror. The same thing is certainly true with our friends. Our closest friends, we often have a bond with because we have shared experiences with them. We have shared values with them. So again, when we look at them, it can be very much like looking in the mirror and seeing ourselves. And Freud is very clear about this. Most love, maybe all of love, at least for Freud, is narcissistic. We love the other because we see ourselves in them. That is his first point. And again, he now contrasts this with another point, but it's also, in a sense, very similar. We also love the other if he deserves it, if he is so much more perfect than myself, that I can love my ideal of my own self in him, right? The second reason we love another, or the reason that they deserve it, is if they represent our ideals, if they represent the best of what we hope and want to be, right? And again, this is the kind of love that can refer to our spouse and can refer to our children, often refers, however, to those role models and teachers and rabbis that we look up to as being the best. Right? Like we all have role models in our lives, or people that we see as representing our ideals, who we admire and we appreciate and we love in a sense. But the reason that we love them is because they represent the best of who we want to be. They represent this ideal picture of who we want to be and the way that we want the world to be. Now, what's interesting here is, if you remember, we've been talking along in these classes, if Reform Judaism and modernity represents the mirror, that you look into the Torah, it's like looking into the mirror. All you see is yourself. All you see is your own values. And Orthodoxy is like looking into the Torah, looking at God, and all you see is an idol, right? You see a fixed form, and which tells you this is what God is, this is what God wants. Well, if the first caveat of Freud is sort of the Reform, the mirror, the second caveat is the Orthodox the idol. And Freud even kind of says that here, right? We see the ideal of our ideals in the other, right? For the Orthodox Jew, they look into the Torah and they say, this is the best document that has ever been, created in the world, right? This is the document, this is the text that represents the highest ideals that human beings could ever hope to be. And therefore, right, if there's any ideas that you might find outside the Torah that seem to contradict the Torah or say the Torah isn't as moral, as holy, as good as we want it to be, right, those texts, those ideas must be inherently wrong because the Torah is the best, right? The Torah is the ideal. That's why we love it, right? If someone was to turn around and, again, make the argument to us or even prove to us that there are certain parts of the Torah that are not the best, that are not beautiful, that are not holy and good, right? We're not going to like that very much. We're going to push them away because for us, the Torah has to be, again, this sort of idol of the best, of the ideals, this idealization. And that's why we love it, right? And again, you see this all the time in Orthodox apologetics, right? The Torah is the best, right? No critique of the Torah can ever be true. It's always false. And we can prove, we can show why the Torah really is the best. Right? That is the Orthodox perspective. And that's why we love it. That's why we love it. That's why we love God. God is viewed as the same way here. I'm using the example of the Torah just because it's a little easier sometimes to see these dynamics than with God. And again, with Reform, they look in the Torah and they find exactly what they want. The best of, modern values, right? Glorifying the individual, freedom, right? Human rights, right? They look into the Torah. That is what they see. So the problem with both of these approaches that we've been talking about all along is that neither of these approaches actually means you love the other for who they are, right? You love them for who you see in them, for who you want them to be. And Freud's point here is that if these is really true, and I think to a large extent it is true, right? Again, most Jews are kind of Reform or Orthodox because it's easy enough to love God, love the Torah. Again, when you can love yourself or love this ideal version that you have. What that means, though, is that when people aren't like you, when people don't represent your values and ideals, when they're not Orthodox, right? It makes it very, very difficult to love them. And that is Freud's fundamental point here, that most people, if this is what love demands, then most people fall outside the circle of our love, which means that v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is a mitzvah that we really can't ever do. And here's what he says here towards the end. He says, talking about, again, what does it mean to love the other, to be commanded to love the other? He says, but if the other is a stranger to me, and if he cannot attract me by any worth of his own, or any significance that he may already have acquired from my emotional life, it will be hard for me to love him. Or if the stranger is just a stranger, which means I don't see myself in them, they don't necessarily represent my ideals, I'm not going to love them. Indeed, I should be wrong to do so, for my love is valued by all my own people as a sign of my preferring them, and it is an injustice to them if I put a stranger on par with them. He's actually noting here something very valuable. It's not just that it's difficult to love the stranger. There's something that seems unethical to love the stranger. Right? It's a very fascinating point, right? Freud is saying there's something unethical about being commanded to love the stranger. Did anybody catch what he's getting at here about why it's unethical to love the stranger? You could think this way, and we do. I want to be clear, we all do. But we have to sort of understand what his argument is. Did anybody catch that? My love is valued by all my own people as a sign of my preferring them, and it is an injustice to them if I put a stranger on par with them. What does that mean? Anyone? Okay. Well, but what I think Freud is getting at here.
You want the people that you love to be special. Or if you love everybody, then how can they be so special?
Right. To be clear, it's not just that we want the people that we love to be special. The people who think we love them, they want that love to feel that it's special, right? If I treat every woman I meet the way that I treat my wife, how is my wife going to feel? Right? Like, it makes like a mockery of the love that I have for her. This is a really, really fascinating point, right? Because normally we think, well, love the stranger, love the person you have no reason to love. What a high ethical ideal. What a wonderful thing. But when we actually encounter people that do this, right, that seem to love those who are unlovable, for lack of a better expression, we don't necessarily find them inspiring, right? We actually find that there's something, or we tend to think there's something actually problematic about them, right?
Well, Zach,
tzedakah to every stranger that they encounter, right? And I was cynical like this, meaning that's not the kind of person I was, or even necessarily am. When I met people who were like that, there was a part of me that always would think, well, you're giving money to everybody, but like, what about your own family? Are you really close to your family? Are you taking care of your family? Right? Like there's an inherent cynicism that we have when we see people love those who are different, because it makes us question, right, their own priorities and preferences. Because again, love is about limiting it to those certain people and valuing them above all others.
Zach,
yeah.
do we actually have a command to love the stranger?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, ger. I mean, we can understand what that means. But yes, the Torah does say you must love the stranger, love the stranger. I mean, the ger is the foreigner. I mean, in the Torah's sense. We can ask who that applies to. Does it, rabbinically, it's typically understood as applying to people, converts. But even they are the stranger in the Jewish community in the sense that they're not like us, right? Every convert, what marks them as different, fundamentally different, is the fact they weren't born a Jew, right? So they wear that difference almost like a scarlet letter on them, assuming they're a ger. So yeah, in that sense, absolutely. The question would become, do Jews have an obligation to love non-Jews? So there are many rabbinic thinkers who argue that yes, the answer is the case, that ahava, right, our commandment to love basically is universal towards all human beings. Certainly Rav Kook thinks that, and there are many, I can go down the list, there's many others who think that as well. But just to finish up Freud's point here, again, that we're commanded to love everybody. How is that possible? And again, as Freud thinks, it's really not possible. He says, but if I am to love him, the other, the one who's different, with this universal love that I'm commanded to, merely because he too is an inhabitant of this earth, like an insect, an earthworm, or a grass snake, then I fear that only a small modicum of my love will fall to his share. What is the point of a precept enunciated with so much solemnity if its fulfillment cannot be recommended as reasonable? And Freud's final point here is, if you're going to tell me I have a commandment to love everybody, then what the other, the one who's different, right? The stranger, the one who doesn't deserve my love, the one who's not like me, the one who doesn't reflect my values, whatever love I'm going to give them is going to be like this. It's going to be like almost nothing. First, the tiniest bit. What is it going to be? It's going to be when you see that panhandler, the beggar, right? You're going to throw them a couple of pennies, right? Like that's the kind of love at best that we can offer the one who again is not like us, who doesn't represent our ideals, who is different, who is strange. And Freud is saying, if the whole point of this mitzvah is at the end, the result is I'm only going to give a few pennies to beggars when I see them, then his whole point is, well, what the heck is this doing at all, right? And again, if it's not really reasonable to love the stranger, to love the other, to love the neighbor, then why is God even commanding us as such a thing? And this is I want to use as the setup, because we're going to see in a moment how Rosenzweig, is struggling with these same questions, that loving the other, right, is a profoundly difficult mitzvah, right? And maybe that's the reason why it's the central mitzvah. But we have to keep in mind that it is profoundly difficult and ask ourselves, what does it really mean to do it properly? At least how does Rosenzweig understand it as such? So to understand how Rosenzweig conceives of this, we have to look at two paradigms that he offers. One is the mystic and the other is the zealot. Now, what's interesting about the mystic and the zealot, as we're going to see, is that the mystic very much represents the approach that I love the other because it's like looking in the mirror, and I'll explain and unpack why that is. And the zealot only loves the other if that other, again, reflects their ideals. And in both cases, both for the mystic and the zealot, the stranger, even just the neighbor who's a little bit different, falls out of our concern, right? They're not in our circle of love. And Rosenzweig we're going to see how Rosenzweig, again, similar to Freud, understands the problematic version of love that is narcissistic, or love that is just, again, idolatrous in a sense. And then we're going to see how Rosenzweig understands what's the proper path for a Jew and for all human beings. So let's first understand the mystic and what is so problematic about the mystic. Rosenzweig does not really like mysticism, at least how mysticism is traditionally conceived. He's critical of it in several places, and he uses a particular metaphor here to describe the mystic, right? And this goes back to Plato. Plato talks about the ring of Gyges, I think it's what it's called. But we'll use the Lord of the Rings because it seemingly draws on Plato, right? So if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, right, there is this one ring, right, that everybody's sort of like fighting over. What happened, or what is the special power of the one ring? What happens when you put the one ring on? Anybody remember? You've all seen Lord of the Rings. You know this. Shlomo, what happens when you put on the one ring, the ring of power in Lord of the Rings?
Zach, I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know the.
Oh, to your credit then. I'm impressed that you managed to stay away from pop culture. When you put on the one ring, right, you disappear. You become invisible. That's the what happens in Lord of the Rings. That's what also happens in Plato's discussion of the Ring of Gyges in Plato's Republic, that you put on the ring and you become invisible. Now, what's interesting is Plato uses this as a way to think about ethics, in a sense. Like, what would you do if you had the power of invisibility? Would you still feel bound by ethics? Because basically the rules of the world wouldn't apply to you. But Rosenzweig compares mysticism to putting on this ring that makes you invisible in the following sense. The way he understands mysticism is that mysticism is all about this idea that you love God so much that you want to be just one with God, right? This idea of unia mystica, right? This idea that mysticism is about becoming one with God, joining with God, right? This idea that everything is God, right? This is a famous idea that even appears in Chassidut and is very popular today in certain neo-Hasidic circles, even some liberal circles, right? Everything is God. All of creation is an illusion. Everything represents an inner oneness. And mysticism is about recognizing that inner oneness, that inner unity of all creation, so that one can recognize that it's not me and you and them. All of those are external appearances that fundamentally melt away in this higher divine unity, right? That's the idea behind mysticism. Now, Rosenzweig doesn't like this idea. And he sees something narcissistic in the idea of mysticism, that we're all one, that we all become one with God. So we have to understand, why does Rosenzweig see this as a narcissistic idea? So here's what he says, and this is in source 1 here, or the source here. Man defined only as an object of divine love is cut off from the whole world and closed in himself. For any normal sensibility, there is in any mysticism something disquietingly and even objectively dangerous. And really is bothered by mysticism. He says, mysticism turns into the cloak that renders the mystic invisible. His soul is open to God, but because it is open only to God, it is invisible for the rest of the world and cut off from it. Right? So what Rosenzweig is saying is, if you really believe everything is one, everything is God, then ultimately other people don't really matter. Not as individuals, not as people who are fundamentally different from yourself, because nobody's fundamentally different from you, because everybody is fundamentally a manifestation of God. Everyone reflects this inner divine unity, which means that the mystic doesn't really have to look at the differences that exist in the world. The mystic only really has to focus on what they see as the shared unity. But Rosenzweig's argument is if all you want to look at is the shared unity that you think is sort of hidden behind creation, that means not really looking at the world at all, because the world is full of difference. Even Kabbalah talks about this. The world we live in is Alma de Peruda. It's the world of separation, the world of difference. It's what sits behind it is Alma de Yehuda, this higher world of unity. But the problem is that if you think we can focus on the unity, it means fundamentally looking away from the difference, right? The fact that everybody is different, fundamentally, radically different from each other. And Rosenzweig says here, he says, with an arrogant sense of security, the mystic turns the ring on his finger, and immediately he is with his God and has nothing more to say to the world, right? And this is where Rosenzweig is getting about mysticism, that it's narcissistic, because it's about this belief that one like sort of has the truth of reality, and that everything fades away, right? Everything sort of, you become invisible, everything fades away when you sort of pursue that singular truth that defines reality, and against like everything is basically absorbed, sublated within it. Now, what Rosenzweig notes here, and again, if you see this language of the mystic is with his God, right? Because again, there's something a bit narcissistic about mysticism, that it's a belief in oneness, but it is a belief that in some ways is driven by this desire that we have to join with that oneness, because we feel that to join with the oneness is the ultimate bliss that a human being can fundamentally have. He says, yeah?
I just want to raise a question. It may be tangential, but it got me thinking. If we were to look at Avraham Avinu, who was the iconoclast and the founder of Judaism, basically, would you characterize him as a mystic or as a zealot?
So that's a very good question. I'm going to argue that he is neither, but it is certainly the case that he gets imagined as both. Right. This is actually a very important point.
What's your third? What's the third alternative?
So we're going to get to that. That's the Rosenzweig's alternative.
Oh, wonderful. Good. Okay.
Yeah, but it's a very good point you make because, well, who is Abraham the mystic? Avraham the mystic is the Avraham that discovers God, right? We could use, in the Rambam sense, to sort of philosophical contemplation or comes to realization of God, right? Avraham is the mystic in the sense that Avraham loves God and God loves Avraham. Avraham is the mystic. Avraham doesn't stay around with other people, right? Avraham has his tent sort of away from others, in part because there's this ideal sense that he wants to be solely with God. He wants to contemplate God. He wants to focus on God. He wants to be with God. And there's a Maimonidean read that very much falls in that way with Avraham. Avraham the mystic, right? The great lover of God, the one who wants to sort of join with God, wants to bring everybody to God, but ultimately in this sort of, again, this oneness. Right, that's Avraham the mystic. Now, the problem with that approach would be that it's an approach that doesn't really care about others for the fact that they are different. And the way that we know that Avraham is not a mystic is that even though Avraham kind of lives away from society, right? What's the famous description, the Midrashic description of Avraham's tent, right? It is open in all directions. Mystics don't live in tents that are open in all directions. Why would a mystic, like, again, who's focused on oneness, divine unity, contemplating the divine, being with the divine, why is a mystic not going to be in a tent that's open on all directions, Shlomo? Well, we know this even just from the story in the beginning in Vayera. If you live in a tent that's open in all directions, what's going to happen when people are passing by?
Oh, you're going to see them.
You're going to see them, right? Where do we typically associate mystics being? Right? If we think of even the famous Talmudic story of Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, right? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, again, is sort of the classic mystic, understood to be the author of the Zohar, right? He is condemned to live where? By God, ultimately, in a cave, right? A cave that is fundamentally cut off from the world. And it's better for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai as well, because when he's in the cave, he can just focus on, his, Kabbalah, mysticism, being with God, right? That's where mystics want to be. They want to be in a place that is cut off from the world. Right, the fact that Avraham's tent is open in all direction cuts against this idea of mysticism in which, he wants to be just one with God and leave everything else behind. Now, I'm going to play it out a little bit because you've already raised it about the zealot, right? So let me try to jump to the zealot a little bit here as well, because Avraham obviously is a good example, right? So what makes the zealot different than the mystic is the zealot knows that there are other people. And the zealot knows that other people matter, but the zealot has a fixed sense of the way things are supposed to be, right? The zealot has an ideal picture of what the other is supposed to be like and what the world is supposed to look like, right? Again, we'll use the Orthodox example here. Orthodox make great zealots because they have the truth. They know exactly what the Torah means and exactly the way all Jews are supposed to follow it, right? And not only that, right? They know exactly what the good Jew looks like, right? And all good Jews are pretty much going to look the same. To the zealot. They have a clear sense of what the ideals are. And a Jew who doesn't look like the zealot's ideals is a Jew who is basically not only not worthy of love, but perhaps even, justifies violence against them in some way. So where do we see Avraham as a zealot? Well, Avraham is a zealot in the classic story that we all know in the sense of the Akedah, right? God tells to Avraham exactly what Avraham thinks he is supposed to do. Right? And God, again, God represents the ideals. God represents the best. God represents all that is holy and good. And therefore, if God's directive is clear, then that is exactly what Avraham should do. Avraham has to live those ideals. And in this circumstance of the Akedah, to live those ideals, those divine ideals, means doing what? It means killing his son. And this is the perpetual problem of the zealot. The zealots in the pursuit of their ideals, what they think to be the ideals, what God really wants, what's the best, what's holy, what's demanded, the zealots in the pursuit of those ideals inevitably ends up trampling over others. Right? The way Rosenzweig will say it is the zealot always sees beyond the neighbor. Right? The neighbor is the one who is closest, which means in many ways the neighbor is kind of random. It's whoever happens to be there. right? But the zealot doesn't care about the person that's right next to you. The zealot is only focused on this ideal picture of where they want things to be, right? With what the world is supposed to look like, what the ideal Jews are supposed to be and think like.
Well,
And
certainly,
let's focus on that. Yeah.
And so with Avram, clearly, the Midrash is addressing that when Avraham smashes the idols, because if that's not zealotry, I don't know what is.
So the difference between, so zealotry is primarily problematic when it is a moral problem. What it means for Rosenzweig, when it means trampling over the other, right? When you're so focused on your religious ideals, this religious end goal, that you are basically willing to sacrifice people along the way because they don't really matter, right? And in that sense, the smashing of the idols is a radical act, but it's not zealotry in the way that zealotry is truly profoundly morally problematic. Right, because he's not smashing people. He's smashing the system, but not people. We could a zealot, the true zealot would have done. He would have killed his father as a way of showing to everybody, right? If you want to prove to the world, right, like how how fake idols are, right? Then rise up and kill your father, who's the idol maker. Smash the idols, kill your father, right? That would be the zealot, the truly zealous act, right? He doesn't do that. Now, we could imagine, again, like I said, Avram's a zealot in the context of the Akedah. He has his religious ideals, and that is what he is pursuing, and the other be damned. But that is not the way the story ends, right? The story does not end with Avram killing his son, right? The story ends either because Avraham realizes that's not what God wants, or again, God confronts him and makes it clear to Avraham that's not what Avraham should ultimately be doing, right? So what we see with Avraham, and again, Avraham is very much the paradigm here. So I thank you, Shlomo, for helping me just tease that out, right? We see somebody who has tendencies towards mysticism, but pushes against it, and tendencies towards zealotry, but ultimately pushes against that as well, right? Because there's a path between them. So I want to explain a little bit more about mysticism and why it's, for Rosenzweig, reflection of narcissism, and then we will look at zealotry, and then we'll look at Rosenzweig himself. So, or you know what? Let me we're not going to have time to do this. I'm just looking as we speak right now. So the problem with the mystic, as I said, is they're so focused on sort of this inner oneness of just being with God that everything else fades away. And there's a sense in which they don't really feel responsible to others, right? If everything is God, I mean, I'll just play this out in the most direct way. If everything is God, then why do I feel any profound responsibility to change the world? Right? If, again, even the problem of death, right? Like, so what? People die, but everything is God. Everything is part of God. Like, death is really just an illusion if that's the case, right? So the mystic ends up, again, absolving themselves from having any real responsibility for others because they are so consumed with just, wanting and desiring that which reflects themselves on a certain level. And again, if we're going to use this in sort of the liberal / reform, the looking in the mirror, right? The challenge always, and again, this is the challenge for both the mystic and the zealot, is anybody who is different is immediately outside your concern. Difference doesn't matter to the mystic. It's not real. We're all really the same. We're all really part of God. Right? This is the classic problem of liberal ethics, is that it attempts to be one size fits all. It attempts to impose a singular standard on everybody. Everybody's human. Everybody's the same. This is exactly what it should look like. Right? That's always the challenge with liberal universalist ethics, that it reflects, again, this one singular value that is all that really matters. That is the problem with mysticism. When we turn to the zealot, again, which is always the problem of orthodoxy, I want to just, play this up a little bit more. For Rosenzweig, the zealot is always zealous, specifically for bringing about the kingdom of heaven. Meaning there's something about the zealot that is always messianic. Right? There's something about the zealots in which they're trying to achieve some, radical religious outcome. Right? It's not just that they're zealous because, Jews should keep like kashrus. Right? They're zealous for things, or if they're zealous for kashrus, it's not just because, it's a mitzvah. They're zealous for kashrus because they think it's like the most important mitzvah. And the fact that Jews are not keeping kosher is somehow a great violation that is preventing, good and holy things from happening. It's not the way we think about kashrus, but I'll give you an example. In the Orthodox world, particularly in the Orthodox world, the mitzvah of tzniut, right? People are very, very zealous about the mitzvah of tzniut in the Haredi world, especially. Right. So you have to understand, well, do Haredim think by being zealous about tzniut, they're helping bring redemption? Not quite. But Haredim do think that violations of tzniut are in some ways the worst moral violations or spiritual violations that a person can do, and that basically have radical consequences, right? When women aren't tsanua, right, it's going to like destroy the world, right? Destroy themselves and destroy the world, right? That's the sort of the mindset, which means that when the zealot is pursuing or trying to enforce, right, the mitzvah of tzniut, right, they do see it in a certain sense as if they are fighting for the kingdom of heaven, right? That they are ensuring that God's holiness and dominion is preserved about that which is most important. But in general, again, the zealous has an ideal picture of where they think the world should be. And it's their job to create, to create that world. Mystic is always somewhat passive, right? The zealot is too active, right? They're too out there trying to force and compel things on everybody. Rosenzweig says here, he says, the zealot, the sectarian, in short, all tyrants of the kingdom of heaven, instead of accelerating the kingdom of heaven, they sooner delay it. Right, so this isn't fascinating. If the mystic isn't doing anything to bring the redeemed world, because the mystic isn't really loving anybody, the mystic is just sort of self-absorbed in their own love of God, right? The zealot in some ways is worse because the zealot is actually preventing redemption, right? Zealotry holds redemption back. It doesn't just fail to move the world towards it. Why does zealotry hold or prevent redemption? It says by leaving their nearest unloved and reaching for the second nearest, right? And what, again, Rosenzweig means by this is that the zealot reaches towards the ideal, and in reaching towards the ideal and trying to impose it on the world, it looks beyond the person that is right next to them, right? This is, I'll give you a very simple example of this, right? One that we're all kind of familiar with, right? You're all probably familiar of the image of like the great activist, right? Or the great leader who basically is so concerned with like, saving the world that they completely ignore their family, right? That they completely ignore their responsibilities to their spouse and their children. And sometimes they're even in such a way abusive towards their spouse and children because they're so consumed by what they think is the most important thing. And that's a simplistic example, but what Rosenzweig is getting at is that you can't ever fix the world by loving this ideal and trying to instill this ideal and not recognizing your obligation to love those who are closest to you. Again, the goal is that we love those that are closest, not because they're necessarily our family. Closest here can just be like my literal neighbor, the person who happens to live upstairs from me, right? But what makes it difficult to love the neighbor who lives upstairs from me is that, like, I don't really know them. Like, they're not really like me. I mean, we have something in common. We live in the same building, but the neighbor is always different, right? Just by definition of being the neighbor. They're not my family, right? They live next door, which makes them always a little bit weird and different. And that is always harder to love, again, the person who's a little bit weird and different than it is to, again, pursue this ideal, this vision, this idol that you have for the way that the world is ultimately supposed to be. And Rosenzweig continues here. He says, basically, whatever good it looks like the zealot is doing, even if it looks like the zealot is fixing the world and doing great things, if they are fundamentally not recognizing what love means, which love means loving those who are different, loving those who just happen to be right near you, then all the work the zealot does to change the world is actually like doesn't bear any fruit. It actually is counterproductive in some fashion. Again, the zealot can act as if they are this, again, great religious person, great moral person, but inevitably in their pursuit of what they think is good and holy, they end up ignoring or outright trampling over others, right? Like to be a zealot means thinking, like at least maybe Abraham did for a moment on his way to Har Moriah. Being a zealot means thinking that like you can kill your son to bring about the holy good that you think God wants in the world. Right, like that's the end point of the zealot is they're willing to sacrifice others for this holy good. And Rosenzweig's point is religiously that just doesn't make any sense, right? We have a responsibility to love everyone, right? Love those who are different, love those who are strange, and it cannot be about imposing our ideals on the world. And that, the zealous approach, which again is the orthodox approach, it actually holds redemption back. Right, it actually holds redemption back, and that is truly and profoundly, problematic. So what you see here, again, in the mystic and the zealot, directly parallels as we saw with Freud, that we love the other either because they are like us, right? Like I see the other in us. It's all about my God and wanting to be one with God, and everything is one with God, but it's really about me, right? And again, we know this. People who are really into spiritual experiences there's a certain sort of narcissism that typically goes along with that, right? People are always want like the better spiritual experience, right? And again, spiritual experiences often mean cutting yourself off from those who are different from others. So you can just like have this moment for yourself, right? Which is what's really important. And as the zealots, as I said, is again, sort of the opposite. It's like they have a vision for the world. They believe God gave them that vision, right? Their vision is basically an idol for them. And they're going to impose it. And anybody who might get in the way or anybody who might be right next to them, they'll be damned. That is the mystic in itself. So where does that leave us? And this, again, is going to take us back to Avraham. That for Rosenzweig, the challenge of loving the neighbor as oneself is the challenge of loving the other who is like you, but not you, right? Loving the other who is like you, but not you. So what does this mean? As we saw before, the mystic doesn't love the other because everything is God and they just want to be with God, right? The zealot doesn't love the other because the other is different from whatever ideals the zealot is trying to impose on the world, right? Loving the other means loving people on some level because we recognize they are like us, but what makes love so profoundly challenging is when we encounter people who are different from us. And oftentimes it's most hard love when we love those who we think are really like us, and then we find out they're really not like us at all, right? That's the moment where love is the hardest. By the way, that's the moment where love is the hardest with our spouses and our children. That's why in some ways this mitzvah is most challenging with those who are literally closest to us because they are really like us, which draws us to them, but they are also inevitably, sometimes infinitely different from us, which makes it really, really, really hard to love them. So here's what Rosenzweig says here. This is the second source. This is page 257 from the Star of Redemption. It says, it is not said to him by God to do unto his neighbor that he would like done to himself, right? So what he is noting here, Rosenzweig, is that the formulation in the Torah is love the neighbor as yourself. But that, of course, does not tell you what to do. It doesn't you can't derive from that any practical steps or directives or behaviors that you are supposed to do. If I tell my children you should love everybody as you love yourself, they're not really going to know what that means, right? Because it's completely ambiguous and unclear, right? The rabbis, others try to derive, practical steps from that injunction, but it's really unclear on its own what that means. One of the classic formulations you find rabbinically for how to understand this is what Hillel tells the convert, right? When the convert comes to Hillel and says, teach me Torah all on one foot, Hillel does not say to him, the greatest mitzvah of the Torah is love the neighbor as yourself. The rest is commentary. Now go study it. He says, that which is hateful unto you, do not do unto others. That which is hateful to you, do not do unto others. And Rosenzweig is noting there's something very important about that when it comes to love, we can't love others as we love ourselves and assume that what is good for us is going to be good for other people. Right? We can't ever assume that what is good for us is going to be good for other people, and therefore to love another person is do what I would want done for me. That's the positive formulation. It's like saying that doesn't work. At best, we can assume the negative formulation. At the very least, don't do to other people things that you don't like. But we can't assume that you should do for other people the things that you do like or that you do think are good. And the reason for that, again, is because other people are different. Other people are fundamentally, infinitely different from us. And therefore, the good that they think is good is potentially different from yours. And therefore, you can't just assume that love means doing what you think you would want for yourself for others. Right? It's a very, very difficult thing for us to grapple with, particularly with those we love. We think the things that matter most to us are the things that we should do for others. And one of the hardest lessons to learn is to realize that the good, human beings may be created in the image of God, but the good is not created in our image. Meaning we don't get to decide what the good is, right? Which is a very, very challenging notion. On some level, the good is dependent on what the individual's needs, desires, and wants ultimately are. Right. And that's a very challenging thing for us because we want the good to be in our own image. We think the good is that which is good for us. And therefore, it's easy for us to do the good for others when it's the kind of good that we think is important. But the moment that there's a good that we don't even identify as good at all, and that's what the other asks of us, that's something that we can't tolerate. That's something that is profoundly difficult to us. So Rosenzweig's point is the very fact that Hillel articulates this in the negative is a way of getting at this fundamental difference that exists between everybody. He says, for man must love his neighbor as himself. But here's the thing, v'ahavta l'recha kimocha. right? You should love the other as you love as yourself. But Rosenzweig notes there, it doesn't say you should love the other as yourself. It says like yourself, kimocha. The other isn't you, they are like you. And this is Rosenzweig's fundamental point. Your neighbor is like you, hence not you, right? To love the other means loving them with their difference. And as we saw before, mystic can't love the other who's different, and the zealot can't love the other who is different. But that is exactly what God is commanding us to do. Now, again, we talked about Avraham, right? How is Avraham the one who sort of is trying to chart a path that is neither the mystic nor the zealot? Well, we see this throughout Avraham's life, right? Avraham is the one who embodies chesed, right? And Kabbalistically, rabbinically, Avraham embodies chesed. Chesed means love. Chesed means, again, gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness. And what is fascinating about Avraham is Avraham extends his love to those who are like him, but ultimately also not him, right? We see this, the classic parrot. There are two places we see this. The first one is the obvious one that we all know. Avraham welcomes guests into his tent. And again, what we have to recognize, and the rabbis are, pick up on this, is that the guests that Avraham welcomes are Canaanites. In a sense, they're sort of like him because he lives in Canaan as well, but they are also fundamentally not him because the Canaanim are idol worshipers, and Avraham only worships and loves the true God. So what Avraham has to do to engage in hospitality is to welcome people in his home that are in a sense radically other, radically different from him. They represent everything on a certain level that Avraham rejects, right? As Shlomo mentioned, Avraham is the one who smashes idols, right? But here he is welcoming idol worshipers into his home. He wouldn't welcome idols into his home, but he does welcome idol worshipers into his home.
But Zach,
Yes.
I think the Rambam points out something a little bit different in the sense of at the end of a meal, he says to he talks to his guests, assuming that they believe in the philosophy of gratitude, and that gratitude is something they were steeped in. And he says to them, don't thank me, thank God.
Right. So that's actually a midrash. And if we had a full shiur, I have a whole thing on this narrative. What's very clear to me is that the rabbis are so bothered by Avraham's radical love and openness to the other that they have to cover it up. They basically, in a series of midrashim, try to argue, well, Avraham, he can't be that open to idol worshipers. Either he's just welcoming them in because he's going to try to convert them, or there's another midrash that basically says he washes their feet and does these other things to basically try to get rid of their idol worship before they come into his home. Right. So I would argue those midrashim are challenged by the radicality of the Torah, because the way the Torah presents itself is no, Avraham loves them in a sense unconditionally. Right, in their difference. That's what it means to love someone unconditionally, is that in their difference, the fact that they don't seem to deserve it, as we saw before with Freud, I still am able to love them. And that is the kind of love that Avraham engages in, because that is the kind of love that chesed always is. Chesed, and we'll see this in a moment, is always undeserved. Right? Chesed is always directed at those who don't actually have a claim on my responsibilities, duties, and obligations. That's what makes chesed so powerful, so unique, as a form of ethics, so to speak, is that it is, again, that which is undeserved, that which is unexpected, and therefore it is that which can basically bridge or reach across all divides that might exist between us and the other. I want to just give you an example of how Rosenzweig says this in one of his letters. I just only came across this yesterday. I was very happy to. It's in German letters that have yet to be translated into English, but thankfully online translation works so well now. It basically, you almost don't need it, formal translation. So here's what Rosenzweig writes in one of his letters about how he understands what does it mean to love the neighbor, to love the other. He says, he's talking about that when he loves somebody, when you care about somebody, when you're close with somebody, he says, you want to hold on to everything about them. He says, that's why I don't erase what I know about someone from others. So one of the challenges is when you're really close with somebody, you'll talk to other people and they may not always have such nice things to say about the people that you're close with or the people that you love, right? This probably happens to you in many points of your life, right? You have a Rebbe or a teacher, a rabbi you really look up to, and then you hear comments from somebody else about how that Rebbe, that rabbi, that teacher really isn't so great, maybe even has some real problems. The normal response is to just reject that. Oh, it's Lashon Hara, I don't want to hear it, to get rid of it. Rosenzweig says that he never, he listens to the Lashon Hara of others. We have to understand what he means by this. He says, that's why I don't erase what I know about someone from others. All images of a person that circulate around the world belong to him, right? The way we are known by everyone, not just the people that think positively about us, but the people that think negatively about us as well, they are all part of who we are. And Rosenzweig is saying we have to grapple with that. And he says, if I want him completely, if I want the other completely, then I include all these images, right? The good and the bad, the good things that are said about them and the bad things that are said about them. Then I include all these images, including the caricatures, pamphlets, even the hate songs in my images of him, right? And how it all has to be there when I love the other, the good and the bad, the part that is like me, the part that is different, the part that represents my ideals and the part that represents the opposite of my ideals. Because again, human beings are always a mix of these things, even if we have a hard time wanting to recognize that. He says, why shouldn't there be laughter, pity, even horror in love, right? The people that we love, right? Even those that are closest to us, there are elements of them that are horrifying. There are elements of them that are pitiable and pathetic, right? There are elements of them that are weird and strange and can make us laugh, but all of that has to be incorporated into the image, into the person that we love. He says, I want to love people completely, just as they are. I don't love angels, right? Angels would be perfect. That's Freud's point in a sense, that the people that we love them because we sort of see them as angels. Rosenzweig is saying, I love people who are like me, who have everything that is dark in their soul, but that they also have what I have in mine, right? That's a fascinating point here, right? Before, Rosenzweig said, we love the other who is like us, but not us. We love them in their difference. And here he's adding to that and saying, we have to recognize that just as there are these parts of ourselves that we recoil from, that we try to repress and push away, so too the other always has those parts as well. And we have to be willing to embrace them as well, right? If you get to know somebody who you really like and you can't find anything wrong with them, then there's something wrong, right? Like that's Rosenzweig's point here. We have to be able to take in the good with the bad. We have to be able to take in the same with the difference. And that is a profoundly difficult thing to do, but that is what love ultimately can do. And I think we know this. In our own lives, we reach points with our children, with our spouses, in which we recoil from the difference, from the otherness within them. And God willing, we've also had the moments where we still say, you know what, I still love them. I still feel drawn to them. I still feel compelled by them, even if they are different from me and radically different in ways that I can never fully understand or appreciate. And if that can occur with our spouses, with our children, with our parents, right? The challenge Rosenzweig is saying is, how do we open ourselves to that possibility with anyone that we might encounter? Again, for Rosenzweig, to love the other is a redemptive moment, which means it doesn't happen that often. But we have to be open to the possibility that it can happen, and it can happen specifically, again, with those who are different, those who are weird, those who are strange, those who appear to us even as evil. That love can be possible in those circumstances. I'll just conclude. We don't have time to show this fully, but as we saw before, the Avram is the embodiment of chesed, and chesed is always radical. Love is always radical, because it can't be defined or fully contained. Right? Rosenzweig explains here in the Star of Redemption. Right? What's fascinating about the Star of Redemption? He notes about the 10 Commandments. Right? There are two sets of commandments. First 5, Bet Adam L'Makam, our responsibilities, our mitzvot directed towards God. The other 5 are our mitzvot, Bet Adam L'Chavero, our moral, ethical obligations towards others. But what Rosenzweig notes, and Chazal, I'm not even sure noticed this, I at least haven't found them note this, is that the 5 commandments that are directed towards, or that direct our ethical, moral responsibilities towards other people, what do those 5 commandments all have in common? They're all formulated in a specific fashion, which is how? They are all negative mitzvot. They are all, don't do that, right? Every one of them, don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't covet, right? They're all don'ts, don't, right? And what's fascinating is that what we might want to see on the 10 Commandments is like an 11th commandment, or a 10th commandment that says, right, love the neighbor as yourself, right? Why is that not there, right? Why is there no positive formulation there? Give tzedakah to the neighbor, right? Shouldn't one of the 10 commandments be give tzedakah, right? Like, you think that's like important enough, like maybe we can leave out don't covet and include, give tzedakah. Rosenzweig's point is that love, there's a floor to love, right? The floor to love is the don'ts, right? Don't do things that hurt others, or at least don't do the things that would hurt you to others. But that's the floor of loving the neighbor. That's the floor of ethics. But there's no ceiling to love, right? It can be anything, right? It can't be defined. It can't be imposed. It can't be predetermined, right? Love is in a sense always free. And that's what makes love fundamentally radical. Avraham is the figure of love in his radicality. It is it's Avraham's love for God that leads him to smash idols, but it's also that same love that enables Avraham to love idol worshipers. And what Rosenzweig gets at with love as redemptive is that it always is radical. Most of what we conceive of as ethics or morality is, again, about a calculated action towards achieving a very specific goal, right? We want to do good things because we believe they bring about good outcomes, right? It's always very calculated. This is the way all political conversation goes, right? We debate about what we think is the better way to structure the world because it will deliver more moral outcomes. Rosenzweig's point is that that is in many ways at best a floor, and often a deceptive one, because it's a floor that turns into a ceiling. But the true ceiling of love and its radicality is that it cannot be predetermined and it cannot be predefined. Love is when we are able to love the other in their difference, in their otherness. And that enables us, again, to step out of the constraints, to step out of the boundaries, definitions, and limitations of the way that the world normally works, right? Love is disruptive to the world. And that's what makes love radical. And that's what ultimately makes love redemptive. But if there's one thing we can take away from, I want you to take away from this year, is that love, what we're always striving for, but it's always so difficult, is a love that is not narcissistic, that we don't just love the other because they look like us, they talk like us, they think like us. And we don't just love the other because they represent these ideals, or that we're going to impose ideals on the other, and that's the way we love them. We know what's best. That's exactly what we're going to try to pursue. Love means being open to the other and their difference, and to recognize that in that love, it enables us to do things for them that we might not even think are good, but are the things that they want and the things that they need. And at the very least, that when they call us, that we're able to say, I'm here. Even though that we don't always even know what's going to come next, but just the ability to say, I'm here, to be able to respond to the other when they call us, that in many ways is the most basic aspect of what it means to love the other in their difference. That my kids, even if they upset me to no end in their difference and how they don't do the things that I want to do, that at some point, even if I feel alienated from the choices that they've made, that when they call me up and they say, Abba, I need you, that there's a part of me that says, because I love them and all their difference, to say, I'm here. And that in itself is a profoundly radical moment and redemptive moment. We'll stop here, and we'll pick up next week with Rosenzweig on redemption.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for being so flexible. The beauty of Zoom.
Do you think we'll be in person next week, Deborah?
Yes, no matter what, we're going to be in person next week.
Okay, sounds good.
It's our last class. Okay, all right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.